Good morning, everyone in U.S. government and political science. I'm going to put up another video, Chapter 2. There is a lot of information in Chapter 2, a lot of fundamental bits of information about the structure of government. And that's what this class really is U.S. government. And Chapter 2 is about the framework of government, the Constitution. And that's sort of the twofold or two-prong um, um, result or elements of the Constitution. One is the framework of government. The other is preserving and protecting specific civil rights and liberties, limitations on governmental power. So we have to study it in great detail. We have to study some of its roots and where it came from. And then the basic framework will be pulled out through the course of that entire second chapter. So very lengthy chapter. It's a lot of critical information. I urge you not only to read it, but reread it, ask questions, and really immerse yourself into it because it's a critical chapter. And those of you that are taking other classes with me or anybody else, like, for example, History of the Constitution or U.S. History 1, this chapter blends very well with aspects of those two courses because it's about the construct of our government. Our nation's birth out of revolution, if you will, ultimately resulted in the U.S. Constitution, and we still live under that Constitution to this day. And when there's been major problems with it, we've found a mechanism by which we have been able to amend the Constitution where it's ever come up short or where there are gaps or ambivalent qualities to it. We've amended it. Only amended it 27 times in its history, and you can figure, if you figure the first 10 kind of came as a package deal just 2 years after the adoption of the fundamental framework of the government, the Constitution was approved, and then 2 years later they added the 10 amendments called the Bill of Rights. If you think about it, then you only have really 17 other amendments. We haven't changed it that much, but occasionally we found that there have been critical flaws with the document, with our nation's history, and we've corrected it. And that's what's one of the beautiful things about the Constitution is the ability to amend it when we recognize it's wrong. It's not an easy process because we don't want to flip-flop and willy-nilly change it just on whims of popular desire, but we want to change it when there's a very strong, overwhelming consensus that the country needs to go into a different direction in terms of how we're governed or in terms of how our personal freedoms and government restrictions will apply. Anyways, let's go back. What happened? Well, those of you that like history like me, you can go back really to the framework of early colonization by many European nations. But by the time of the Revolution, we were English colonies. Yeah, I know the French were here, the Spanish were here, the Dutch were here, the Swedes were here, the Germans were here. There are many different colonization groups. But ultimately, through war and attrition and basically power maneuvering, the colonies became identified as British colonies. And those that were in the colonies weren't thinking of Great Britain as a repugnant power that was tyrannical or abusive. In fact, for a great deal of its existence, the colonial system was very supportive of British rule. They identified as being Britain. They kind of glorified it. So what changed? What went wrong? Well, part of it was Great Britain allowed a lot of self-rule and autonomy in the colonies. So colonies had a fair amount of, although recognition as being part of the British Empire, they were also left to their own accord for the most part. Yeah, there were some things that restricted the colonists to benefit Mother England, like the Navigation Acts and the system of mercantilism, that trade would be balanced in favor of ultimately improving the empire as a whole. But it was a symbiotic relationship. Symbiotic meaning it benefited both sides. And the colonists were very happy for many, many years living under sort of the umbrella of the British Empire. What went wrong? What changed? Well, it was a series of things. Nothing is ever like, oh, no taxation without representation. Now we have a revolution. Yeah, that's the slogan, and that is part of it, but it's much more complex than that. What leads up to it is the 7 Years' War, which is also called the French and Indian War. I remember being a kid and a young person in college, and I remember getting very confused one day in class, and luckily the professor thought I was just being a wise guy. And I said, we've been talking about the 7 Year War all day, and I was wondering if we could get to the French and Indian War. And I said, you're a hot ticket, very funny. And the person next to me goes, it's the same thing. And it is. It's the same thing. The 7 Years' War is the same exact war as the French and Indian War, just two different names for the same conflict. And what that ultimately did was basically wipe out French power in the North American continent for the most part, and really make the British dominant not only here in the North American continent, but really in the world. Great Britain wins the war against France. It was really almost a world war between the French and the English, and it's been going on for hundreds of years. Now the English come out dominating the outcome of that war, and the war was partially fought here on North American soil. The colonists helped out to some degree, but it was largely fought by British regulars, and there was some commitment from British colonials, us, if you will, but not our whole backbone was put into it. But anyways, we win the war. Great Britain wins the war. We celebrate it. We celebrate, hey, God save the king and all that kind of stuff. We're rallying around the empire. The British Empire won this really terrible war, and it solidifies Great Britain as the greatest power on the face of the earth at the time. Sounds good. Everything's great. Well, it almost bankrupts the British Empire. The British Empire is victorious in battle, but it nearly kills them financially. The expenditures of the war were overwhelming and it was breaking its back. So, what did they have to do to sort of make some changes as a result of it? They started wanting to reel in control of the colonies, both financially and in terms of governance. And this is what starts changing that dynamic. So initially, these proclamations that came in 1763 were about taxation, the Navigation Act now being much more firmly enforced, about imports and exports, and the first initial taxation. You guys, maybe you know the history. This isn't too much of a history class, but you have to have some history in political science and government. We know the first one that started up was the Sugar Act, then it goes to the Stamp Act, then it goes to the Townshend Acts, then the Declaratory Acts, and then eventually we get to these the Coercive Acts, which is just what they were, coercive, in that they took away much of our own local governance, took away our jury system, tried people in military courts or admiralty courts, or actually shipped them all the way up to Halifax to get the jurors to be basically British loyalists and not colonial members of the community, which would often acquit people who were not obeying the crackdown from Great Britain. So this crackdown, over taxation, over control, over governance, over things that the colonists saw as basic civil rights and rights of man that were allowed in Great Britain should also be allowed in the colonies. And symbolic of that was the right of representation in government. And they're saying we don't have any right of representation. We choose to be taxed. We need to take part in that decision-making process. Great Britain says you do get a choice. You get something called virtual representation. The members of the parliament back in England are representing you too. It's called virtual representation. We had a philosophical view that was somewhat different. We believed in the same rights and concepts and philosophies as the British did, but we also believed that when there was a debate about its implementation, we should have representation by the people and of the people from the community. And that was the concept of no taxation without representation. If you want taxation, we have to have a voice in the decision-making process. And that's where the slogan comes from. But it was more than just taxation, as you probably realize. And then we know Great Britain started quartering military people in civilians' homes right here in Boston. They started confiscating goods of people that were suspected of being rebellious. And then, of course, the Boston Tea Party. We have the Boston Massacre, which wasn't quite the massacre it was made out to be. But nonetheless, there's these tensions that keep rising and rising and rising until the colonists said, you know what? We want to be treated like true British citizens. We want things that were contained in the British Constitution that don't seem to be applied here at home. Things like the right to a jury trial, the right to the preservation of property, the protection of property rights, and the rights of representation. Those things were thought of as being fundamental to being a British citizen, and we just kind of felt like we're being deprived of it. It's not that we wanted to break away from the British concept, but we wanted the British concept applied equitably and sort of at home rule, if you will, back here at home, and it wasn't going to happen. And there was hope for peace right up into the beginning of the Revolutionary War, and it just didn't happen. We finally broke away, and then eventually there's certain things that are called the breaking points. Obviously, when the first battles break out at Lexington and Concord, and then obviously Bunker Hill, and then when Great Britain hires German professional troops to come over, it's seen as though there's no chance for olive branch and settlement. We're going to break away. But the underlying philosophical foundations are actually found in the British Constitution. We like some of those things that were contained in British philosophy. John Locke's, Thomas Hobbes, and of course our own local guy, meaning a colonist himself, Thomas Paine, wrote a book called Common Sense. And the view was that government and the people should be of a social compact, that citizens and people have certain inalienable rights. And one of them is to have a permissive government, a government that's ordained by the people, that the people accept. Otherwise, it won't work. And if it doesn't work, the people have a right to throw the yoke of that government off because it's oppressive. And this philosophy was well founded in Great Britain, but now we wanted it here at home, and it was a more fervent style here in the colonies. And when it really took off, well, the revolution happens. But when we started developing a framework of government, it wasn't that inconsistent with many of the qualities that were contained within that of the British Empire. One coming out of the Magna Carta, the others called the Rights of Man. One's in the 1600s, one's in the 1215, roughly the Magna Carta, and the other's the Rights of Man. Things like being tried by a jury, property rights, right to due process, the right to petition the government, things like that were all fundamental to being a British citizen, and we wanted it here at home, here in the colonies. So we break away. We know we have a successful revolution. It took several years to get it done. I think mostly because the British weren't able to put their entire backbone into the battle. And it was a war of attrition back here on American soil. A number of factors went into it. This isn't a class about the Revolutionary War, but we win. So what happens after we win? It's over, right? What are we going to do? We're going to create a government that we believe is representative of our values. And our values is what? Self-government, meaning we decide. The power emanates from the people, not from a monarchy down, not from a chosen ruling class that flows down, but by the people will pick the government, and the government will be the people, chosen by the people, a representative form of government, not a pure democracy. A lot of people think we're fighting for democracy. Democracy was considered a very dirty term at this time. Pure democracy is mob rule. If all we have are popular decisions by a majority rule, governance would be fairly easy. It'd be very chaotic. Minority opinions, those that were in the outskirts of the viewpoints, if you will, that were popular in a day, might be what? Might be jailed, might be incarcerated, might be killed, might be shunned or thrown off the spectrum of political participation. So we wanted to create a government of limited authority, and we wanted to create not a pure democracy, but a representative democracy that had certain checks and balances built within it, so no one group or one individual could ever get so much power to become tyrannical. Now, careful here. A lot of people think, well, we wanted this democracy so everyone could participate in it and everyone could have a say, and it would be like a more pure form of democracy, or something similar to the old ancient Athens, Greece type of democracy. That wasn't true. When we were talking about democracy in this era, it was those white males that were of a certain age, but almost as importantly, had a stake in society. They had a certain degree of wealth and success. They usually had to be landowning or at least paying property tax in order to participate in the democratic process. Those were the people that they were looking to participate in governance. But we've come a long way. We've become much more democratized over time. People are surprised by that. Revolutionary America was not so revolutionary for all people. Women weren't going to be allowed to participate, and men who were poor were not going to be allowed to participate, and nor African Americans not only not going to be allowed to participate, they wouldn't even be deemed citizens, never mind participating in the voting process or actually representing their interests in the community. We know all of those people were discriminated against in terms of democratic participation initially. The good news is, with the amendment process, we have recognized that as great wrongs in our history, and we've changed that through the amendment process. Changed it through Civil War too, but the Civil War ultimately took on a legal component by amending the Constitution to end slavery and to end vote denial to women and vote denial to African American males and other ethnic groups as well. Anyways, I'm off track a little bit. Get the Revolutionary War. We win. We get to create a government. Initially, because the states, people really identified themselves as being members of a state, it was 13 states governments. Basically, it was 13 sovereignties. 13 sovereignty means power, structure of government. Basically, had 13 little nations that agreed to be a confederacy. Each state had its own authority, and very little authority was shared in the Confederation, meaning the central government. The federal government was a real paper tiger. In theory, they were responsible for negotiating foreign treaties, but they really had no power over tariffs, trade, interstate and intrastate, international, and also between the states, and coining of money. Very, very difficult. No power to tax. They were anemic. It wasn't all terrible. It was called the Articles of Confederation. It allowed us to be identified as a nation. We were finally the United, we were called the United States of America under the Articles of Confederation, but the Articles of Confederation were anemic and they weren't very effective. And really right here in Massachusetts was the death knell to it. It lasted roughly 7 years, 6-7 years. And it was something called the Shays Rebellion. A group of farmers that were hugely indebted were losing their farms in bankruptcy court. And the farmers wanted redress from the government. The government were basically ignoring them. And so many of these farmers that were about to lose their land and their property and their homes rebelled, and many of them were members of the Revolutionary Continental Army in the first place. So they were speaking the same language as the original revolution. They came and they nearly took over some of the Western Mass courts. They took over some of the municipal buildings, and their final sort of press, and it almost was successful, was to take over the Springfield Armory where all the armaments were being made for the Continental Army. And they came very close to taking it over, and the federal government could do nothing about it. The governor of Massachusetts, is clamoring for help from the federal government. We need federal troops. We don't have any federal troops. We don't have any federal power. We don't have any federal money. We don't have to do anything. And if I'm not mistaken, the governor of Massachusetts actually had to hire like a private army to basically quash Shays' rebellion. And people like George Washington and other revolutionary heroes said, our country is falling apart right before our eyes. This is outrageous. One more Shays' rebellion and the whole thing's given up. And what is the message to the rest of the world? We're weak. We're not united. We're falling apart. And it was worse than just Shays' rebellion. States were taxing each other's imports and exports between states, because remember, each state was like its own little country. And states were fighting over port authority coming into the port of New York. Goods would come out there, but if your goods were going to go to Connecticut, New York would tax the hell out of it. And so states were about to go to actual physical violence between each other over imports and exports. Each state was coining its own money. It was chaos. Things are going downhill fast. So we recognize, although we were successful in breaking away from Great Britain, the form of government we made was too weak on a national scale and too strong on state and local rule. Some people love that, and still a debate to this day. How much power should be centralized? How much power should be reserved to the states? But we recognize that almost no power was given to the federal government, and it wasn't working. We needed to do something. So after 6 or 7 years under the Articles of Confederation, a group gets together initially, and they go to Annapolis. Only 5 states showed up, but Hamilton was there. I think Madison was there. A few other, I think John Adams was even there. Some of the power brokers are there, and they recognize that, man, the Articles of Confederation are just not working. They're a failure. We got to do something else. So they agreed to meet a year later. Where do they meet? Philadelphia, the great Philadelphia Convention Hall. It's called now Constitutional Hall. They meet down there in the summer of '87. They meet for 4 or 5 months, and all the players come. Every state's invited. And all this they were supposed to do is, let's come down and talk about the Articles of Confederation and see if we can amend it. But what was the problem with amending the Articles of Confederation? Every state had to agree. It had to be unanimous. And if you've ever been involved in done something that requires a unanimous vote, guess what happens? Nothing. There's always one oddball or 2 oddballs that are going to say, I don't like it, I disagree, unless I get something in return. And so they recognize that the whole scheme of even amending the Articles of Confederation wouldn't work. So this time, more of the colonies come. In fact, 12 of the 13 colonies. The one colony that didn't come, Rhode Island. Rhode Island's kind of known to be kind of an oddball, right? So anyways, Rhode Island has come, but the other 12 come down, and all the big rock stars of the Revolution are there. George Washington, Alexander Hamilton from New York, James Madison, but many, many people that, were part of the backbone of the Revolution are also part of the backbone of creating our new Constitution. A lot of people suggest that when these people went down there, they had no idea about what the framework of government should be. There was no framework to work off of. That's a bit of an illusion. Remember, all of the states had constitutions and frameworks of government, some of them working pretty well, and some of them being a model for checks and balances and limiting government authority, one of them being Massachusetts. Massachusetts' constitution was roughly 10 years older than the federal constitution when it ultimately gets adopted. And if you compare the two in terms of framework, an executive, president, executive, governor, a legislature with a Senate and a House of Representatives. Federal level, Senate with a House of Representatives and legislature, a judiciary to interpret laws and apply laws and resolve civil and criminal conflict. Federal level, state level has the same thing. Methods of appointment and election, very similar between the state of Massachusetts form of government, and ultimately it was adopted by the federal. So to say they had nothing to work off of, and they came up with this real original concept, it's nonsense. They saw the experiments being done in all 13 colonies and tried to pick and choose some of the things that worked most successfully. These men all had things at stake. Their states had things at stake, and they all had different interests going on. So it was quite a challenge for them to come to an agreement. We know James Madison, who's been called the author of the United States Constitution, or the father of the Constitution. He came with a very specific idea about what the framework should be. Real smart guy, lawyer. He's not exactly the most charismatic character, but he's wicked smart. And like anything else, if someone comes with a plan and writes it up and proposes something in writing, they usually get a more, I think it's a great negotiation technique, because otherwise parties just tend to work off of some tangible concepts that are delivered there. So there's three plans that are kind of toyed around. You should know this for basic civics. The first one is the Virginia plan. That's just it. Why they call it Virginia? Because the guy that's proposing it is James Madison. He's from Virginia. In there, he wanted a very, very strong central government, strong federal government. The states would have a very limited degree of home rule or sovereignty. Much of the power would be given to the federal government. But the legislature, which is the most important branch, at least it was at the time of framing, was going to be made up of members of the Congress based upon state population alone. So if you were from a large state, and back then it would be states like New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Massachusetts, I think might have been the fourth at the time in terms of population, not geographical size, of the 13 colonies. Larger states would rule. Smaller states said, why do we want to join a federal government that's going to be very powerful, almost omnipotent over states? If we're a small state and we're sovereign right now, why do we give up all of our power when larger states like Virginia, New York, Pennsylvania are going to rule the roost? Why would Maryland and Delaware, in the Carolinas, in Vermont, why would they give up their sovereignty? It didn't make sense. So they said, we're going to walk away. So they had to come up with a compromise. Initially, someone comes up with the New Jersey plan. So the Virginia plan is a pretty good plan. It's got a House and a Senate. So there's going to be some checks and balances in the legislature to create law. But we needed something different on how these members would actually be representing their states. So the great compromise, initially someone said, well, but now we got another plan. It was a Jersey plan. Jersey plan is just basically, let's clean up the Articles of Confederation. Let's amend the process by which we amend the Articles of Confederation, make it like a supermajority instead of a unanimous decision, maybe 9 out of 13. Give them the power to regulate commerce, give them the power to tax, which were the two major weaknesses under the Articles of Confederation, and that would work. Because that's what really the main problems are. I actually thought that's not a bad. If I was down there and I was hearing this in New Jersey plan, like, well, our problems with the Articles of Confederation are what? No power of taxation, no power to regulate commerce. Seems like two big gaping wounds. We can heal those. Let's go with that, because we're not given this authority to change the whole governmental structure when we're down here in Philadelphia. We're supposed to tweak the Articles of Confederation. That would seem like it worked. But there was enough consensus when the New Jersey plan got bantered about that it wasn't just going to work. We needed more of a fundamental change. So they're working off the Virginia plan. They're leaning towards that. But again, the smaller states are going to walk away. And then a guy named Roger Sherman, not just him, but probably other people as well. But there's always someone that gets the credit, right? Roger Sherman from Connecticut. Sometimes you'll see things named after Roger Sherman Highway. You wonder why it's named after the guy. Roger Sherman was at the convention as one of the great, revolutionary leaders, recognized we needed a government. Says, let's take that Virginia plan and let's modify it. It's called the Great Compromise. And here's the compromise. Big states should have more representation in part of the legislature. Small states should have some degree of, if not equality, equity in the stake of government. Otherwise, they're not going to join. So how do they do it? They created a bicameral legislature. So there's first we're going to have three branches of government. There's going to be checks and balances between them. We really get to the checks and balances in later chapters. But, the president can veto laws if he doesn't think they're appropriate. The legislature can override the vetoes of the president. The president picks members of his or her cabinet to run certain administrative arms of government, but they need the consent of the Senate. The president picks the members of the judiciary, but the Senate has to approve. And later, we're going to learn the courts can shoot down an act of Congress or an act of the president if it's unconstitutional. That's just a little thumbnail checks and balance allusion to it, right? But initially, how are we going to get the government to be formed? And the big thing was over how representation would work. And so the Sherman plan says, big states, you will get more representation in the legislature, but let's split the legislature and we'll call it a bicameral. All bicameral means two houses in one home or two branches in one home. One branch should be called the House of Representatives, kind of like the House or the Commons in the Great British Parliament procedure. The House of Commons. These are going to be the representation of their people, picked by the people of their community, and each state will send a congressperson based upon a population number that they'll determine. And that changed from year to year. Right now, we have 435 members of the House of Representatives selected throughout the country. And now some states will have more than others. It's all based upon population. Maybe 10 years ago, we lost one member of the House of Representatives, not because he retired. And that was a guy right out of, used to be an Amherst chemistry professor. Can't remember his name. I met him several times. He retired, ironically, right at the same time that the population shifted somewhat out of Massachusetts, grew somewhere like in Texas or Florida. They pick up a Congress member in the House of Representatives. We lost one. Richie Neal's, other people's seats grew they also grew geographically, but they grow based upon population. So a Congress member in the House of Representatives outside of Boston might have a small geographical area, but very dense in population. Then somebody out in Western Mass, like Richie Neal, my congressperson, I live in Brimfield, Mass, he represents a very broad geographical area, but roughly the same population. Every Congress member in the House of Representatives is supposed to be representing somebody from their from a similar population number. So that makes the larger states very happy. Now the smaller states are saying, "Whoa, I thought we weren't going to agree to this. We're going to fix it with the upper house, the second branch of the legislature," and that's called the Senate. The Senate, every state will get 2 senators. Therefore, small states get very happy. And then we were worried about this tyrannical government getting too big, government getting too professional and creating like a political class. How are we going to do that? Well, we were going to make election cycles for the House of Representatives be very rapid. Every 2 years, the members of the House of Representatives would be up for election. And on the Senate side, we wanted more stability. The framers were sort of conservative. They didn't want government just to be overthrown in one election cycle. They wanted some stability. So the Senate, being considered to be a more statesman-like group, a more educated group, a more professional group, would serve a 6-year term. And here's the thing that surprised a lot of people. People back in their communities would not vote for their senators directly. They wanted indirect democracy, buffers between the people and popular will and sound government. So senators would be picked by state legislative governments. That was true right up until 1913. That surprised a lot of people. I was going to say when I was a little kid. I wasn't even born, obviously. Neither was my father even born in 1913. Sometimes I think like, oh, it wasn't that long ago. But in the scheme of history, it wasn't really that long ago that we did not elect our U.S. senators directly. They were picked by the state legislature. And why did our framers think that? Because we wanted government to be thoughtful and to be professional and to be kind of conservative in terms of maturity. And so one is the age is higher. You have to be 30 years old to be in the U.S. Senate. House of Representatives, you have to be 25. But in order to be chosen, the House of Representatives is a more common aspect. People get to vote that are eligible to vote for your representatives in the House of Representatives. But on the Senate, they thought that the state legislators would know who the great leading public servants would be that should go and serve their state in Washington, D.C. It was another one of these checks and balances built in it. We removed that after 1913. We become more democratized. Now we elect our U.S. senators. And now this confuses a lot of people. We'll talk a lot about it in a later chapter. They also didn't want the Senate elections, whether they be done by the state legislature or now by popular vote within the states, to be done at the same time. So they buffered them, meaning that 1/3 of all U.S. senators are up for election every 2 years. Now, some people are going to say, wait a minute, didn't Georgia just elect 2 United States senators in the same election cycle? You're wrong, Corman. Right, and I may sound wrong, but I'm right on this one. One of the terms is for a 6-year traditional term because the seat was opened. The other is to replace a senator that passed away. His term is not up. So they had a special election to finish out his term. So the next time these 2 candidates come up or their seats come up for election, they'll be staggered. Every time you run now, you run for a 6-year seat. But the other person in your state, and hopefully you know who your 2 U.S. senators are from Massachusetts. At the time of this video, it's Ed Markey. He just won re-election. He's going to do 6 years. The other U.S. senator we have is Elizabeth Warren. She has another full either 2 or 4 years. I can't, but it's staggered. They're not up for election at the same time. However, say it is 2 years from now. two-year elections coming up. Elizabeth Warren will be up for election. Ed Markey, unfortunately, passes away or gets ill and decides to retire. They might have a special election at the same time, so there's an election at the same time, but the terms are staggered. That way, the nation creates stability. People don't do things in the heat of passion without throwing off the fundamental stability of government was part of the checks and balances they wanted. So we ultimately adopt the Sherman Plan, which is basically a tweaking of the Virginia Plan, which was written and produced by our own James Madison. And here's the brilliance of it. It comes out of there, and a lot of people are upset. And a lot of people that were down there that were advocating for some of the governmental structures actually back away from it because there's no Bill of Rights. And I'm a big Bill of Rights guy. I'm a criminal defense attorney, and I'm just a big believer in limited government. And one of the things that does limit government in terms of interfering with my freedoms, Bill of Rights. No Bill of Rights. There are some things in the body of the Constitution that give me some civil liberties, like no bills of attainders and no ex post facto laws, which I'll talk about in later chapters. But there's no Bill of Rights. And a lot of members that left Philadelphia, I forgot how many people were down there, 75 or so many people that were down. So, we're not going to support this thing. There's no Bill of Rights. I don't like it. Or we don't like the framework of government. We don't think there should be a president. And that's the other thing, too. We have the compromise. One is of how the legislature is going to be made up, but there's debates about what the president should be. Should it be a council? Should it be one person? Should they be picked by the legislature? Should they be elected by popular vote? And that's one of the things that's usually in the back of many of your minds. It's something called the Electoral College actually picks the president. We vote for the president on popular vote, but what you're actually voting for is a slate of electors that will go down to their local state legislatures on, I think it's December 14th, and they'll cast their vote based upon what the citizens vote for in their state. But there's some question about whether the electors are actually bound by that vote that was popular within their state, or can they use their own free will to change their opinion because it serves the government as well. I think it might change someday to go one vote, one person, but right now it's still the Electoral College. If you look back, not that far ago, I was going to say Elizabeth Clinton. It's not Elizabeth. It's Hillary Clinton actually won the popular vote nationwide, but lost the Electoral College vote to Donald Trump. And then you can also look to George Bush versus Al Gore. Al Gore won the popular vote, but George Bush won the Electoral College vote. I'm not talking about voter fraud or the number. This is actually a fact. They won the popular vote, and they also lost, factually, the Electoral College without any kind of shenanigans. It's just a fact. You don't win the presidency always by popular vote. You sometimes win by Electoral College vote. That upsets a lot of people because it seems like a mystery, and we'll do that in a later chapter. I don't want to get too bogged down in it, but that's also a check on what? Direct popular democracy. They wanted a buffer called the Electoral College, which I think is getting a bit archaic and arcane and misunderstood by the American people, and it might be done away with through a constitutional amendment down the road. And then the judiciary is Article 3. So if you go through the Constitution, they created basically 7 articles. The first 3 that I'm really concentrating on today. First, they created the legislature, Article 1, with an upper house, the Senate, serves 6 years, terms are staggered, and a lower house, the House of Representatives. And where's the checks and balances in that? Any law that's proposed has to travel through both branches, and eventually it comes out, and they have to be identical in the end in order for that bill to be sent to the president for signature or veto. If it's not identical, it never gets proposed. It never comes out of the Congress. And that's what the framers wanted. They didn't want legislation, laws to be passed willy-nilly. They wanted it to be challenging to make sure there was consensus between really the aristocratic branch of government at the time, the Senate, and the more commoners branch of government, the House of Representatives, to come to agreement on the Americans' need for changes in law. There we go. And you got to remember who could vote back then. Mostly white. Actually, very early on, some states still had religious requirements. You had to be a member of good standing of certain church affiliations in order to participate in civic life. Pretty much was ending right around this time anyways. But prior to that, there was some history that religious tests were involved in civic participation. We moved away from that dramatically right at the inception of the Constitution. So we know the Declaration of Independence, I just looking through the book, things I didn't mention, that's a political statement, doesn't have any legal bearing, but it does outline our political philosophy that there's certain unalienable rights that the government should never be able to take away. And when we create our government, we're going to recognize that the government should be what? A government of limited power, and a government that has clear checks and balances on its authority, and a government that has limitations on invading into certain fundamental rights that we call the inalienable rights, which will be articulated in the Bill of Rights and in later amendments to the Constitution. Here's the thing I love. This chapter should be broken down to like 5 chapters. So we've got this new proposal out. It's over, right? And a lot of people do. Films I watch all the time. I watch discussions on they leave Philadelphia and they got a new constitution. Like bells are ringing. We have a new constitution and it works for another. It's still working to this day, even though every so often it seems to be like things are going to brew and overthrow it. But it's been working, with little warts and bumps and roads. But for the big picture of things, it's been working great. What I find amazing is that's not really what happened. After they get out of Philadelphia, they realize in order for when you read the preamble, those of you that knew us in my history of the Constitution, the thing we're going to first study in the second week is the preamble. We, the people, in order to form a more perfect union, we're going to create this government. We, the people, not the powerful, not the rich, not those currently in government. The people will decide if this is what we want for a government. So how do they do it? After the proposal comes out, they send it back to the states, not for the state legislatures to vote on it. We don't want people in power to determine whether or not this is going to be an adopted constitution. We wanted each state to set up special state conventions, constitutional conventions, to either approve or disapprove the new constitution. And it took a long time for this to happen. So they set it out for the states, and 2 camps develop. And you should know this. One camp thinks this is the greatest idea, get away from that weak, anemic Articles of Confederation, get to this new adoption of a strong central government and a retention of states' rights too, a balanced federalism, which is chapter 3. They're trying to sell it. How do they sell it? They write articles in newspapers, pamphlets. I was going to say radio and TV, but no, it sounds like a certain politician that says things like that from time to time. And you probably think I'm thinking Trump. I'm not. I just know sometimes little faux pas about history. Somebody says, I got on the radio. The radio wasn't even invented. But they did. They wrote these articles. And what do we call those paper documents that were trying to sell the adoption of the Constitution? It was called the it was called the Federalists. The Federalists were pushing for the adoption of a new constitution. They were trying to sell it through propaganda. And they wrote something called the Federalist Papers. And it was people like Hamilton, John Jay, a few other of the great revolutionary leaders would write these newspaper articles, and the educated, those that were going to be able to vote probably, would be reading these articles about the proponents of passing the constitutional proposal. And the Federalist Papers we use to this day to try to understand what the different aspects of the Constitution must mean, because the Federalists were also the authors of the Constitution, because they're the ones that are going out and selling it, trying to tell it what it means and why it's beneficial. There was a second camp that was going around. They were called the Anti-Federalists. Terrible name. Whenever you pick a name for some kind of organization that's trying to do something, don't call it anti-something. You call it something else. Call it the Freedom Party or something. But when you call it the Anti-Federalists, your one existence is for one purpose, and that's to stop a positive. So the Anti-Federalists are going around and say, hey, it's going to create way too strong a federal government. It's going to create all the centralized power. It's probably going to be down in Philadelphia or New York, and we might be up in Vermont or in Delaware or down in Georgia, and we're going to lose all that local autonomy. Don't pass it. The problem with the Anti-Federalists, they were often made up of poor agrarian working types, the middling class, where the Federalists were the wealthy lawyers and merchants and successful financiers, and they had better political power. They had better propaganda. They had the Federalist Papers. So as it's going around, each state's going to vote on it, and the Federalists do a great job on selling it. The Anti-Federalists have a bit of a mixed message that's less clear and less disseminated. But what was the Anti-Federalist main message? The federal government is going to be too strong. Your civil rights and liberties are going to be lost. It's going to create tyranny. So the Federalists went out and sold something. What did they sell? Right after the structure of government's adopted, we promise at the first Congress, we're going to pass a Bill of Rights to make sure certain inalienable rights will be, freedom of speech, freedom of petition to government, right to jury trial, right to counsel, unreasonable searches and seizures would be banned. All of these things will be adopted within the first constitutional meeting of the Congress, and people believed that. They thought these were men of honor, and they said, they'll follow through on it. So that's pretty much what broke the back of the Anti-Federalists to get the different states to ultimately approve the Constitution. But when it went state by state, a lot of people say, it's such a beautiful idea. The U.S. Constitution is such a beautiful thing. Here's how close it was in Massachusetts. I just took a photograph of the vote. Kind of a weird thing to take a photograph because I never can remember it. This is how close it was. And you got to think how small the state population was at the time. They had over 300, I think about 340 people, all the different communities. We have 351 cities and towns in Massachusetts, so maybe it was 351. I don't know if we had 351 cities and towns in that time period, but you can see every town and city had a representative sent to Boston to vote on the approval of the Constitution. A lot of people think it was a landslide, right? 187 in favor, 168 against. The Constitution in its time was very controversial. And many people have said that it was Massachusetts that would make or break it. If Massachusetts passed, other states like New York, the other big states, New York being one of them, would ultimately probably come into the fold. And that's exactly what happened. And eventually took 2 years, but by 1787 it gets proposed, 1789 it gets adopted. It took 2 years to get out enough of the states. You needed 9 of the states to approve it for all 13 to be bound by it, and eventually all 13 do sign up on it. And what did they do in 1791? 2 years ultimately after the adoption of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights are passed. And that's sort of the history of it in a nutshell. But the chapters got, small versus large. And one of the things I didn't even put in this little thing, I might as well put it in now while I've got it up so I don't feel like I have to do an amendment, is there's all kinds of compromises. One of them is over slavery. The southern states are worried that we're not going to get that much say, and there's different cultural values over trade, over governance, over all kinds of issues. And Southerners that are participating in the Constitutional Congress are saying, wait a minute, if we're going to get so many members of the House of Representatives based upon population, we want all the people to be counted. And people in the northern states says, well, you're not treating African Americans like people, so the people shouldn't be counted in the census. You shouldn't get to count them because you'll get more reps based upon just the fact that there's slaves being held in your state. And so the great compromise there was called the 3/5 compromise. It wasn't to value African Americans in terms of their existence or their value as a human being, but it was done for purposes of census as a compromise, because the North said there's no way we're going to count them as a full person in the census. It's going to give the South too much power in the House of Representatives. And the South said we won't join if they're not counted in some fashion. So the 3/5 compromise means that every time there basically is 5 African American slaves in existence in the southern states, they will count for 3 people on the census, 3/5. Every 5 equals 3. That's disgusting, because it's a recognition. It says 3/5 of all the person, but everyone knows it was about slaves. There's still slavery in the North at this time, but it was diminished significantly as the economic needs changed. Everyone says, well, the North was more humane and more recognition of the moral wrong of slavery at this inception. I'm not so sure it was so much of that as about the economy of slavery was more beneficial in the South. And the North benefited through a chain of economic processes. They might not have slavery directly in it, but the slavery always dealt in the commerce, especially of textiles and tobaccos and other agrarian results, where middlemen and financiers of the North benefited from too. So that's the other compromise. Another one is the 1808 compromise, that the South was very paranoid that the North would someday try to cut off the slave trade. And they said that we recognize that might well happen, and we just want the federal government not to have the authority to end the slave trade until 1808. That was put in there. Guess when the slave trade was ended? 1808. There was enough consensus to end it. That didn't mean slavery ended in 1808. It meant that foreign importation of new slaves would be banned. At that juncture, we didn't. The slave industry, I hate to call it that, but that's what it was self-propagating, and therefore the importation of new slaves wasn't nearly as a controversial an issue with the South in 1808 as one might think. And then the beautiful change, the amendment process. They recognize we have to have an ability to amend this thing, but we don't want it done easily. We don't just like pass a law. That's too easy. The fundamental framework of government, just to be changed like that, would be too much. So the amendment process, there's 2 different prongs. We'll go to it over in detail in a different chapter, much greater detail. But basically, it needs both the House and the Senate by 2/3. 2/3 of the House and the Senate have to say, we want to amend the Constitution by doing A, B, and C. Then 3/4 of the states have to agree that the amendment be made. That's a very difficult process to get 2/3 House, 2/3 of the Senate, 3/4 of the states. All of those things have to happen before we amend the United States Constitution. But the thing that I'm really proud of, and the thing that makes me really proud as an American, is we have done some beautiful things in terms of correcting some real evils in our time with the amendment process. The 13th Amendment ends slavery. The 14th Amendment recognizes African Americans as Americans. The 15th Amendment bans the racial inequality in the ability to vote for African American males. And then later, the 19th Amendment ends the suffrage movement. It allows women to vote, bringing down the age, 26th Amendment, 25th Amendment, I don't know, but basically reducing the age on federal elections down to 18. Some of these things are really beautiful. Some of them are esoteric, like not allowing the president to have more than 2 elected terms in their lifetime, because FDR was elected 4 times and we didn't think we wanted anybody in power for that long. That was inconsistent with American values in terms of conglomerating power in one individual too much or groups of individuals. But when we see great wrongs, we have the power as a people to change it through a difficult process. But if it's important, and if we agree as a major consensus, we do change the Constitution. Chapter 2 is huge, and I just went on and on. I was supposed to put up 5-minute videos, and I'm at like 46 minutes. I apologize. I know I missed a lot from this chapter because there is so much in there about the different philosophies and views, and the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, the ratification campaign. Oh my goodness! And a lot of people think the other. No, you didn't talk about the other check. And you talked about the check between the internally within the House of Representatives, but there's also a check in that we're going to give the government just enumerated powers. That's one thing I really want to make clear. We'll do that in a later chapter when we talk specifically just about the Congress. The Congress has the power to create laws for anything? No, just in those realms where we gave them power to do so. Some powers are relegated to back, reserved to the states, called the reserved powers. Others, they simply just don't have the power to deal with in the federal government. The government shouldn't be involved in every single thing in our lives or have the power to be. And so we wanted a government of limited authority. So that's another check on the federal government. There's checks internally between the House and the Senate, and the president being able to veto and or to direct things in a certain way, and also the legislature being able to override the Senate. But it's also a limitation on how much power they're granted anyways. And then the other is the checks and balances between state government, the tension between state and federal. That got largely resolved with the Civil War, making the federal government clearly dominant, really increasing federal power with the 14th Amendment. But there's all kinds of checks and balances. And the reason why I don't talk about the courts is it wasn't really written in the Constitution that clearly. It came about a famous case, and we'll talk about that later on, called Marbury versus Madison. A lot of you are not in history. A lot of you are not in political science. A lot of you are not pre-law students. And a lot of you are saying, what the hell am I in this course for? This is just way over my head, or it's something I don't really want to do. I'm just fired up about it. I'm just trying to give you a review about what I think. But I think the book says it all. I test right out of the book. I use questions pretty much right out of the book. And I only test on the fundamentals. So when I get sidetracked in these little tributaries as I'm talking with excitement about the concepts, don't panic. I'm just trying to give themes that enhance, I think, what the book is trying to put out. And again, if I'm going over stuff and you're saying, geez, he went on this tangent, next thing you know, he's talking about some crazy stuff about his father or his sister or something, telling some story. Shoot me an email. Shoot me a text. So I'm not getting this concept. What about this thing? What about this thing? How come we're not talking about that? I'd gladly have a conversation with you, and then I'll probably share it with the class. If I said, geez, that is something really important. I kind of blew over or didn't really focus in on. But some people like to see these videos. I know it's just a minority of you, but every port in the storm. So if I can help a few of you that like it, great. If those of you that like the book better, or some other resources that I'm going to put up as we go forward, great. And I just want everyone to do well and have as many opportunities to learn this information. Be well.